Nistuni Danigo Sabinaki Nimoch do Gena. My name is Dr. Gabrielle Lindstrom. Weasel is my maiden name. That's what I'm going under now. I'm from the Gaina Nation, also known as the Blood Tribe. I introduced myself in Blackfoot, as well as called myself by my Blackfoot name, which is Sabinaki, and that name was gifted to me by my dad when I graduated with my master's it's been well over 10 years. What's interesting about that and why I introduced myself in Blackfoot is because it's taken me nearly 50 years just to say those few words, whereas I should have gotten a Blackfoot name right when I was born, and because of settler colonialism and the ongoing genocide that Indigenous people are going through, I just learned to say those few words in Blackfoot. Most recently, I don't have my language, I'm not fluent in it, and so when I say those words, I say it proudly, but it has taken me nearly 50 years to learn to say those words.
My name is Dr. Bukola Salami. I'm a professor at the Cummins School of Medicine, University of Calgary. A bit about my background. I was born in Nigeria, and I migrated to Canada at the age of 16, and started high school in Nigeria, completed high school here. And then after that, I went to the University of Windsor to do my Bachelor's of Science in Nursing, Master's in Nursing from the University of Toronto, and PhD in Nursing from the University of Toronto. My initial research was with Philippine educated nurses. That really, my doctoral work was all for the family, the migration of Philippine educated nurses to Ontario through the Living Caregiver Program. And really it showed how the pain of family separation has an impact on Philippine nurses.
My name is Abdullah Ahmed. I am the program coordinator for the Enhanced Settlement Workers in Schools program, which works with the public, Catholic, and the charter school boards. We work out of over 300 schools in Edmonton alone. My background is program management and development. I have been delivering evidence-based programs that are mainly focusing on drugs and addiction, crime prevention, and mental health, and youth-related specific programs. I've been working on this program for the last 3 years, and it's a pilot program that's been funded by the federal government under the IRCC umbrella.
I work as an associate professor in Indigenous Studies with Mount Royal University, and in that role, my main focus is teaching. I also am an active Indigenous researcher in the community, working in both academic research, but also community research as well, community-driven research, and so there's quite a difference there. And so I talk to my students quite a bit about the importance of not only drawing on academic knowledge, but their lived experience, because we bring who we are to every encounter that we have, whether that's our learning encounters or our in friends, whatever it is, we bring who we are there. And so it's so important to look at those lived experiences and integrate them into professional and academic contexts. I mainly work, my research is concerned with advancing an understanding of who Indigenous people are as we understand ourselves. So how have we experienced Canadian nation building? How have we experienced the Canadian legal system, the social systems that structure our lives? And how can we tell our story in ways that are true to our experience and not in ways that are influenced by deficit perspectives that have been imposed on us as Indigenous people.
When I came to Alberta, I started looking at the issue about immigrant health in Canada, including the mental health of immigrants. My first work with the Black population was on parenting and mental health promotion practices of African immigrants in Alberta. And at that time, I did that work with Edmonton Immigrant Services Association and Africa Center. And we interviewed African immigrant parents and stakeholders and community leaders to find out about parenting practices. And it shed some light on issues related to discipline, parenting, issues related to mental health too. And we heard stories about the experiences of children within the school system, and how children oftentimes in the school system experience discrimination, how they are often channeled into less demanding academic paths because of the perspective or the perception about Black kids in the school system. We also heard about the values of parents, African parents, and the values include respect and religious values, and also values related to education that was strong, but as I said, those values were very much constrained by the education. And we learned about the limitations that parents face, trying to, for example, support their educational paths of their kids, while at the same time them experiencing downward occupational mobility, and how that has an impact on the educational success or perceptions of children.
I've been working in this sector for the past 17 years, and previously I've been working with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I was spearheading and looking after its Global Maritime Crime Program, and then I moved to the United Nations Office Development Program, and then from there I moved on to Public Safety Canada funded programs that were addressing children and youth and those who are having pre and post migration trauma-related issues, drugs and addiction. The overall vision of EMCN is to augment the need that exists within the community, especially those with a background of newcomers, communities that are coming from overseas. As soon as they come to Canada, the life in Canada is different from reality, what people know outside of Canada. That's where EMCN comes and connects those newcomers to resources, services, and supports. EMCN was created 40 years ago, 1982. As a result of the need that also existed at that time, the newcomers were going through, and as such to this day has withstood the test of time by being able to support not only newcomers but also collaborating with other service providers within the sector, facilitating government funded programs, pooling and bringing resources together, supporting other areas of service delivery within the community.
I think Indigenous youth have been facing an ongoing interruption of Indigenous cultural continuity. And this has been happening since settlers have been coming onto these lands that now sustain us all. And when I talk about interruption in cultural continuity, that includes the way an Indigenous identity is formed in community, through ceremony, through language, all of those sort of cultural reference points that have sustained Indigenous youth for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So there's been a fracturing of that, of those reference points. And so now, instead of having Indigenous reference points that are grounded in language, that are grounded in the stories of the community, that are grounded in our ontological responsibilities. So what makes us feel real? What makes us feel authentic as Indigenous people, not as Indigenous people trying to be white, for example, as Indigenous people trying to fit into mainstream society. And so that fracturing has led to now what we're seeing in terms of the challenges that Indigenous youth are experiencing. And what we're seeing is a continuous rise in youth, Indigenous youth, homelessness. We see the youth that have grown up in foster care system, and as soon as they turn 16, 17, 18 years old, as soon as what the system calls aging out, and then we see the youth not being prepared with the basic life skills, how to do taxes, how does credit work, all of those kinds of things. What about rent, how to budget, how to create a relationship with money, with finances, things like that. So none of that is being imparted, those kinds of life skills. And so they age out of the foster care system. They end up on the streets in many instances, still very much fractured from traditional practices, alienated from language, alienated from community in many instances. And so we have youth who are wandering around on the streets and very much not knowing who they are, where they come from, and even why that matters. And so this legacy of colonization, it continues today. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that it is going unrecognized, it's going unexamined, and because of that, ongoing experiences with colonial violence, racism, discrimination, marginalization, those experiences are invalidated. And because of that, many youth grow up feeling less than, feeling they're not heard. Their experiences don't seem to matter by mainstream society, the education system, the social systems, all of that. And so in 2019, I did a research project for the Blood Tribe, where we looked at addressing racism in the southern Alberta area. And so we did that, we undertook that on our own because the settler society wasn't doing anything about it. The research that was out there was written from a non-Indigenous perspective, using non-Indigenous methods, non-Indigenous methodologies. Those methodologies that are constructed from a Western settler lens are insufficient in capturing an Indigenous reality with racism, how we experience racism, how we understand it. So that research that I did, we looked at experiences with racism. We asked our participants their experiences with racism from when they were children. And so what the findings show is that Indigenous, and generally speaking, so I'll generalize now because I'm speaking about the experience of Blood Tribe members, but we might even generalize that. So experiences with racism happen very early on in life. And with some of the participants, these experiences were as early as they could remember. And so they experience this early in life, and it continues to be a presence in their life right into adulthood. And so one of the questions we asked was, do you think those experiences with racism when you were a child, did they shape your identity later in life? How you see yourself, how you think society sees you? And nearly all of our participants answered yes, those experiences negatively affected how I see myself as an Indigenous person, how I value myself, and how others perceive me, how I think others perceive me as an Indigenous person.
I created in 2019-2020 the Black Youth Mentorship and Leadership Program, which is a program to socially and economically empower Black youths to contribute meaningfully to the Canadian society. We've had around 150 Black youths going through the program, mainly high school youths in grade 11 and grade 12, and it's really showing. Some of the things that I've learned through the program is the strengths that many of our kids have. And when I set up the program, I thought I was going to be mentoring Black youth, but then I didn't realize how much Black youth can actually mentor themselves and support themselves. And also the importance of community belonging and positive cultural identity that the program like that could create for Black youth. For example, there was one youth that talked about the experience of experiencing racism, and they went to a black therapist, to a white therapist, and the white therapist is like, "What? Oh, what? Are you sure?" And just wants to really just brush out and do talk about something else because they were not used to talking about racism. Another youth talked about sleeping over at a friend's house and being made fun of her lip. And she also, that same youth also talked about crossing the street and someone throwing a sloppy at her and calling her the N-word. She internalized that, and that continued to accept our self-perception of herself. So, she talked about, wanting to be white so bad, wanting to have a different hair, a different lip, and that was all linked to our experience of racism. So those are some of the research that we've done. Lately, we interviewed youths across Canada, and we did a survey of around 1,000 Black youths across Canada. And the survey found about, it was on the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of Black youths. And Black youths talked about, oftentimes when we think about COVID-19, we think, COVID-19 is affecting health and mental health and intersecting with mental health. The particularities of being a Black youth is that you also had the Black Lives Matter movement happening at the same time. So you had the re-traumatization from COVID, you had the COVID-19 itself, the threat of COVID-19, and then you had the mental health, all intersecting together to contribute to your mental health. And that has a serious consequence, including experience of reawakening related to racial discrimination.
Some of the challenges that our youth have been experiencing, that they have been going through, were mainly to do with resources. Access to resources was a major issue because when there is a language barrier, and then at the same time when there is a cultural barriers, and the environment is new, their parents have not been exposed to the ins and outs of the healthcare system as well as the available resources within the community, and that's been really very challenging for the newcomers. At the same time also, there were other family stresses because then we had a challenge that were coming from unemployment, food insecurity. At the same time also there were underlying health conditions that were as a result of pre-migration issues that the clients have experienced due to them being in refugee camps, migrating between different countries before they came to even Canada, some of them. So those were the issues that were really putting barriers in front of the clients that we serve, but at the same time also there was social and academic challenge. And that included also integrating within the community, being able to interact and also have access to available resources, which was impossible for them due to also COVID, which was really extremely affecting their safety and as well as emotional well-being with relation to also their community connections. So that was a major setback to the clients and the communities that we serve. EMCN is part of the bigger picture, which is the C5. That includes Bent Arrow and it includes other service providers. And we were able to overcome and also help and be there for our clients. And that's really one of the major contributors that we can say that EMCN has so far been able to achieve.
I'd like to share a little bit of my own story growing up. So I grew up on the Blood Indian Reserve, and so I was born and raised there. And unless a person understands what it's like to grow up and to experience being cloistered away on a small landmass, and the only time you leave there is to get groceries or to go do laundry, things like that. But for most of your life, most of your time, you're on this reserve. And so growing up, I always wondered, I asked myself, why am I growing up on a reserve? Don't they put wild animals on reserves? And I'm thinking about the African wildlife reserves. And so I learned about that when I was a child. And I was wondering, well, why am I on a reserve? And so I grew up very much learning the rest of the provincial curriculum, kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum. I learned that even though I was on the reserve. So I didn't learn anything about Indigenous people. And what little that I did learn about Indigenous people, it was as if we were part of the local wildlife, as if we were just standing in the way of progress. So I grew up thinking that it was normal to be segregated on a separate landmass. I grew up thinking that it was normal that white society looks down on us. I grew up wanting to be white because that's all I ever saw around me was the success stories about white people. Beauty ideals were all, you know, sort of framed by blonde hair, you know, blue eyes, all of that. And I could never aspire to anything like that at all. And so I grew up thinking of very less, like thinking that I was less than. And when starting when I was 13, you know, I made multiple suicide attempts to end my life. And that occurred for, you know, right up until I was 15 years old. And then I got pregnant when I was 16 and had my daughter Maria. And I went to I started high school when I was 17, and I went to Catholic Central in Lethbridge. And there, it was a culture shock for me, like a huge culture shock, because growing up on the reserve, you know, it's very sheltered. It's like, that's all you know. And then, of course, I mean, I left. I mean, I knew that, you know, the context of my life was, you know, the broader Canadian society, but I didn't have much experience with it. So when I started high school, I'll never forget that day in my career and life management course when I was 17, and I was the only Indigenous kid in class. And so my teacher comes on, and she comes out and she's talking about teenage pregnancy. And then she starts talking about Indigenous girls and teenage pregnancy. And then she starts talking about how the only way to solve that problem is to sterilize Indigenous girls when they're very young, because all they're ever going to do is just keep having babies and be a burden on taxpayers, will only ever be welfare mothers. So I'm sitting there listening to my teacher, and you know, I've got tears welling up, and I'm just feeling awful. And I couldn't listen anymore, so I left. I left class, and then I ended up getting into trouble for leaving class. And so I was the problem. It wasn't, I needed to be more forgiving of my teacher because she didn't know. And so these are the experiences that I had as a youth going to high school. And that's just one experience. I've had multiple. And so it turned me off so much from school that I didn't start university until I was 30 years old, nearly 30 years old. And then so I started university, and in university it was the same thing. Very much marginalized. Didn't learn anything about Indigenous people from our perspective. And so when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I remember, you know, mainstream educators, they'll say things like, if Indigenous people would only get educated, then all of their problems would be solved. And so there I was, an educated woman with a university degree, and I still couldn't find a job. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe I should go back to school. So I did. I went and I got into a master's program at the University of Lethbridge. And there I looked at homelessness, Indigenous homelessness, and what are the reasons that bring us into this homeless state, and what does home mean for Indigenous people. So my research was around addressing homelessness, Indigenous homelessness. That was my master's research. So I graduated with my master's degree in 2011, and I moved to Calgary, and I still couldn't find a job. People still were not hiring me. And so I was experiencing this sort of people saying, okay, you need to get educated. There I was, very educated with a undergrad and a graduate degree, and I still couldn't find a job. And so I was like, okay, so I finally did find a job. And it was a pretty decent job, but what drew me to my current research now is, and which is really concerned with understanding how trauma impacts our learning and the ability to retain information and to learn effectively. So it was my experiences working as the manager of the Chinook Lodge Indigenous Student Support Center with SAIT Polytechnic, where I was supporting Indigenous students in terms of ensuring that they felt like they belonged at this Western institution. And so what I noticed there was that my experiences growing up on the reserve, my experiences in post-secondary, they were not unique at all. In fact, it was quite common, and many had it they had it worse than I did. And so looking at those students coming into the Chinook Lodge, some of them having just saved their brother or sister from an opioid overdose, or having witnessed extreme violence, or students who are living in their cars trying to get to school, or parked outside of the post-secondary of SAIT, and all of these really sorrow stories, I guess you could say, that really prompted me to go back to school and do some research and say, okay, what is it that Indigenous people, why are we having such a hard time retaining information? Why are we having such a hard time staying in school and being successful in school? And so I started a PhD program in 2014 with the University of Calgary, where I was in the adult learning specialization, and I looked at the interplay between trauma and resilience in the post-secondary experiences of Indigenous adult learners. And so what that research, some of the findings from that research were those barriers that we experience in high school and in post-secondary. Those barriers were constructed early on in our lives, and we didn't have any control over those barriers. So the only control we have is recognizing that those barriers exist and gathering the fortitude and strength to overcome those barriers. But those barriers are intensified through poverty. They're intensified through the continual loss of identity, which Indigenous youth try to regain through joining gangs, things like that, and which only further sets them up for even more experiences with violence and further alienates them from their Indigenous culture. Another thing that I should mention as well is it's not just my lived experience and my academic research, but I've also worked with Indigenous youth in high school as well. And so one interesting finding is that a C-train ticket or a transit ticket, not having funds to pay for your transit ticket and then getting issued where you have to pay, issued a fine and not paying that fine, that then leads to a warrant for the youth's arrest. And once that is issued, and then a youth may go into the remand center where they connect with other youth who are engaged in criminal activity. And then from there, they just spiral into that criminal sort of lifestyle. And this all happens because they couldn't pay for a transit ticket. And so what are some of the things that society can do to ensure that Indigenous youth are not funneled into the justice system, are not funneled into the social service system, are automatically are not looked upon as if they're failures in society? See, that's not in the control of Indigenous youth, but that is in the control of every single Canadian to change their perspective and learn about who they are. So the biggest challenge to that is our education system today, because our kindergarten to grade 12 education system has at its core a series of outcomes that are focused on gathering external knowledge. So everything is external to us. Learning about other people is done through diversity training, through awareness training. But even when we're younger in our K-12 education experience, learning about other people is always done from a distance. So we learn to celebrate cultural differences. We don't actually learn to participate in different cultures other than our own. So it's as if our education system is constructed in a way where we're always these objective observers of what's happening around us, rather than active participants in relationships, and creating these relationships with people who don't look like us, don't talk like us, don't act like us. Those kinds of relationships. How do you foster a relationship with someone who is from an entirely different culture from you when the education system tells us the best way to learn about somebody else is to study their culture rather than actually go and have coffee with someone, or to actually be a part of that culture in meaningful and authentic ways? It's almost as if we're leaning into our fear rather than deconstructing that fear.
So some of the challenges that the policymakers need to understand, specifically here in Canada, and specifically in Alberta, is, for instance, the housing. Housing is a major issue problem that affects the newcomer communities. It's not an easy to be able to be housed. It takes years to be on a waiting list. At the same time, during that time, people also are suffering other challenges, including employment, including maybe medical health conditions, and that also exacerbates their conditions and even makes way much more. In terms of the taxpayers, dollars, what the government can do with the supports that's going to be provided, way much more difficult, because when the issues are not taken care of ahead of time, taking care of them at a time when things get out of control is going to be way much more difficult and a lot more resource consuming.
Some of the work that I do now is aimed at assisting other professors and educators to engage with Indigenous knowledge, with Indigenous cultures in meaningful ways. We need to only look at the statistics that are on the government website that will tell a story about Indigenous people that's based in deficit constructions of Indigenous people that then shape stereotypes. They construct these stereotypes of, the Indigenous youth that do nothing but steal, Indigenous youth who are, teenage pregnancy statistics. So we have We have Indigenous people, whether they're Indigenous youth, Indigenous women, Indigenous men, or Indigenous Two-Spirit, where our stories are already told for us, and it's based in this deficit perspective. So how do we start moving beyond that? As I said, we look at Indigenous perseverance and Indigenous strength, and we hear those stories as Indigenous people tell them, as they experience them. But one of the most important things is we actually believe them. We believe them, and we honor that story, and we say, okay, that's been your experience. And even though that hasn't been my experience, I believe you, and I validate your experience through that belief. And so I think that even that little move makes a mountain of difference for an Indigenous youth to feel heard, to be seen, to feel validated, all of that. And that can just turn somebody's life around in that moment.
There are lots of things that could be done to address the well-being and improve the well-being and life of Black youths in Canada. I think one of those things that could be done across all settings is mentorship. Our youths need mentors, and our youths need people to support them and to mentor them and to provide them with a path. We have a situation in Canada where we have a cappuccino effect, where Black people are always on the underneath and white, oftentimes, and whiteness on top. And we need to steer that. A way to steer that is not through tapping shoulders, it's through actually looking for people that look different from you, such as Black youths, and seeing in terms of how they can be supported, how they can, how you can point them in the right direction. I think one of the things that we need within our system, educational system, justice system, healthcare system, is anti-racist practices and policies. And by anti-racist policies and practices, I do not mean a situation where we don't see color. I mean a situation where we understand that inequities exist, we see it, and then we actually do something about it, and we evaluate some of the things that we do. One of the challenges that we have in terms of anti-racism is that we propose anti-racism initiatives, but we don't actually evaluate anti-racism initiatives. So sometimes, during periods of intense challenges, we throw in, different measures and different interventions. Whether or not those interventions are evidence-based, we do not propose. Another thing that is very, very important is the competence of practitioners and healthcare professionals and police officers. One of the challenges that we have is that, within the standards for many professionals, we do not have anything that talks about being anti-racist within it. That has to change. Because what happens, especially within the healthcare profession, is if anti-racism is not a standard or a code of ethics, then actually that means you can be competent and still be racist at the same time. So that has to change. Anti-racism needs to be included in our evaluation measures. I think one thing on an individual level of addressing racism is a self-awareness, awareness of our own social positioning, and awareness of the relationship between our own social positioning and others in the society.
Rather than focusing on the external trappings of Indigenous culture, and by that I mean the colorful regalia, the stereotype of, Indigenous people are so much closer to nature, the hypersexualization of Indigenous men and women. And so Indigenous men are sites of violence, Indigenous women are sites of victimization, Indigenous children become sites of hopelessness. And so let's start moving beyond that. And how we can do that is by intentionally developing self-reflective models that can be incorporated as early as kindergarten, right up through our grade 12, right into our post-secondary education system, into our professional development contexts. So these self-reflective models will offer a gateway for people to learn more about who they are. Who am I as a Canadian? Where do I come from? And it's not enough to say, well, my family has been here for 4 generations. No, you are still a settler on these lands unless your language and your culture has been shaped by these lands, and then you're also still an immigrant, you just got here a little bit earlier than the rest of the people. And so we need to start offering that safe space for people to really learn about who they are, where they come from, and why that matters. And so that goes for the same for Indigenous youth as well. It's right now that we have what we call a pan-Indigenous approach to understanding and exploring Indigenous cultures, where there's this idea that Indigenous cultures are all the same. We need to start pushing back against that, because there are over 600 Indigenous nations in Canada alone, each with their own language. And so there's incredible diversity within Indigenous culture. And so we need to start understanding it that way. But at the same time, we also need to understand that as people, we're diverse as well. We have diversity of thinking. We have not just a diversity of skin tone. So the focus then is we're looking at the physical characteristics of people when we need to go deeper. We need to understand what is the cultural paradigm that is shaping who I am. So we always start with where a person is at. And if a person doesn't know where they're at, which many times they don't, given the history of our K-12 education system, it's not set up for people to really explore who they are. So starting where a person is at is very difficult if that person doesn't know where they're at. And then what is a pathway forward as a good relative? Not just, and I don't use the term ally, I use the term relative. Because when we use the term ally, it's very human-centric, and it assumes that this person that I'm an ally to hardly has any power. That's not true, because as human beings, we all are empowered. We already are. We already have our personal power.
One thing that I have realized from our youth is that our youth are so much stronger than I have ever thought they are. They are very, very brilliant. I think it's very, very important to focus on that strength. Surrounding yourself with positive people. And I always say to our youth, it's always very, very important to focus on your long-term goal rather than on short-term goal. Because when you focus on your short-term goal, you can really, really miss the path. And that's so many opportunities that you can tap onto. So I know, for example, some youths at the national level involved with, CIHR Institute for Human Development, Child and Youth Health, Youth Advisory Committee, the Prime Minister's Youth Councils, the CDR's Youth Councils. Get involved, get engaged, volunteer. It's so important to volunteer. And, it's talking as a 16-year-old, when I first arrived in Canada, one thing that, got me here is the connections, the volunteering. Yes, you do not get paid. But yes, you do get paid in terms of the skills and the opportunities that you develop from some of those volunteer experience. And that you also feel good about yourself, that you're contributing positively to the Canadian society. And racism and discrimination are very, very real. Surrounding yourself with positive people to help you and challenging other forms of racism is very, very important.
We've never lived in a context where everybody is the same. and we shouldn't. You know, and then now it's like people are saying, well, we need to treat everybody equally. Yeah, but not everybody is equal, you know, and capitalism and the way our society is set up, it wouldn't work. Capitalism wouldn't work if everybody really was equal. Capitalism only works if there is if there are the haves and the have-nots, and it also wouldn't function without poverty. And so we need to ask ourselves, what are the alternatives? What is another way? So with Indigenous youth, okay, you're on the street, then this is just hypothetically speaking, okay, you may be on the street now. What is the alternative to that? And what are the steps you need to take to get you out of that? Because nobody can take those steps for you. We might be able to light the path, but ultimately that path is yours to walk. And whether you decide to take up that journey is really up to that individual. So guiding youth on this pathway, it's almost like they're going back home to who they are as an Indigenous person. And it's Indigenous culture that saves our lives.
My advice to the youth is never feel alone. Tap onto someone, talk to the person that you trust, ask them for help. You are no longer all by yourself. We know that sometimes for us, what we do is to address those issues. We come up or also share information orientation sessions where we are educating the parents and also caregivers and also educators within the school, public, board, Catholic, as well as the charter system, where we kind of like addressing if there's issues that are related to conflict resolution, difficulty within coping mechanisms, stress management. We address anger management. All of those issues are the sessions and information-oriented sessions that we provide. I think the advice I'm going to give the youth is understand there's resources. You can talk to us. You can reach out to the Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers. You can talk to any of your educators within the public or within the board, 3 board schools, and at the same time be able to ask for help.
I experienced my own struggles with addictions and all of that, and it was only through going back and learning about who I am as a Blackfoot woman, learning about my Blackfoot values for living a good life, and actually integrating those values into my life, that I've been able to not only help myself, but in that process of helping myself, I've been helping others as well to create the kind of future where they feel like they belong in that future. They're not creating that future for someone else, but it's for themselves.